A very special Indiekings right here, right now, because I got a guest, Lisa Brown.
Hello.
Welcome to the studio. I'm very excited that you're here. How would you introduce yourself, actually?
I guess I'm a game designer.
Mm-hmm.
I've worked in both AAA and indie, but most recently I've been indie for about a year now. And I am currently the game designer in residence at Harrisburg University in Pennsylvania over in the States, which is a year-long thing where I'm there on the campus advising like the game students and helping them with their projects and whatnot, but I still get to work on my own project. Yeah, it's a really cool program. And then after that, who knows? But primarily I would introduce myself as a game designer.
Cool. Because the first thing I read really fascinated me. You were a designer at Insomniac for like 6 years?
Yes, I started there in, I don't know, whatever,
6 years
ago,
I 2010?
I guess it was technically 2009, I believe. So yeah, it's coming up on 7 years now. In the industry total, but I was there for about 6, and I was a designer I was an intern on Resistance 2, and then a full designer on Resistance 3 and Sunset Overdrive, and then they had me do an experiment. They used me as a guinea pig for. They were trying out some different things and wanted to try making a small game. Yeah. So I led a small team of like 5 people and made a little game called Slow Down Bull, which I was designer on, but also sort of like general game lead on that. Cool. And I like to describe that as it's like indie with training wheels because it was run as an indie project, but I still had access to the resources of the company. Yeah. So it was pretty fun. Yeah, cool. And then you went on your like indie adventure. Yes, I did. Was that a big difference? Because I imagine it would. Oh yes, it was huge. Yeah. The reason I chose to go indie, all these things were just aligning perfectly. I was already sort of involved with the scene. I just shipped that game. I had paid off my student loans. Important. So I actually had savings and no debt, and Freedom. I don't have a house. I don't have other obligations. So I was like, if I'm going to do it, I should do it now. Yeah. And I sort of tumbled into it because I knew if I thought about it for too long, I would get scared and not do it. Yeah. So it was a huge change. Mainly, it was the first time I'd ever done any sort of freelancing. So the first time I didn't know where the money was going to come from necessarily, and that ended up being super stressful. Yeah, because you have to learn about contracting. But it was ultimately positive. I decided I have a Patreon. That's on developer streams, so I do dev streaming and focus sort of on an educational slant, sort of teaching, like just doing design analysis, making games and having people watch and that sort of thing. So that was my Patreon. At the same time, I was making sort of small non-commercial games. Imaginal was one of those, which is what I released over the summer. And then I also did contract work on Hyperlight Drifter. I helped them with level design. Really? Yeah, for about a year. That's one of my favorite games. Yay! Man, we even talked about it today while recording. Yeah. So, I loved it. Great. So, wow, I didn't even know that. Yes. See, that's why we were talking about needing to update my website. That's like one of the things I need to add. This other game I worked on just shipped. So. Yeah. Whoops. Not a small title as well. That was a fun experience. But I was fascinated with your, you tried to sum it up, but you're doing so much. Yes. Like you just gave a talk here in Holland like a week ago, and like you would say you're a game designer, so education is kind of a sidetrack, but at the same time, don't you really enjoy that, or what? Yeah, what is your goal? Oh gosh. Oh well. We were chatting about this, about long-term goals and how I'm terrible at setting them. Yeah. So I did an exercise with my mentor to try and figure out, like, I need to focus. I need to figure out what I'm focused on. Yeah. And he was like, well, write down every project you're working on, every single thing you're working on, and then go through them and answer the question, why are you doing this? Yeah. for every single one.
Which is a helpful exercise for everyone,
it was
I guess.
super helpful because I'm terrible at setting long-term goals, but in the process of doing that, I discovered that I had long-term goals and I was working on them without my knowing it. Yeah. So it may as well know, and one of the most common answer to why are you doing this was, well, I want to help other people get better at design. Which was with the focus of the streams, and that's why I give a bunch of talks, and then why I'm trying out this residency. Yeah. So yeah, it's been an interesting experience because this is the first time I've worked sort of in formal education, like in academia, and it's very different than the informal stuff. Yeah. But looking back, I realized even when I was at Insomniac, I was always doing like mentorship programs and going back to my schools and speaking and just like getting people aware about games and game design and whatnot. So it's been around for a while.
Yeah, really cool. But don't you like find that the appreciation from people or the feedback from working with people in education is really direct?
Direct.
Yeah, it's like if you make a game like Hyperlight Drifter. I mean, people love the design of Hyperlight Drifter, which you contributed to. Yeah. But like, I'm amazed right now. Like, I would really, you can see I'm glad right now that you worked on that great product. But like, that's way later, and people have to know that. So if you're making games, you're putting a lot of effort into something. And unless you look at forums online, and people on the internet can be bitches, so it's not even all positive. But with education, you could, if you do your job right, get immediate feedback on your work. So I'm really wondering, now that you kind of had seen both spectrums, what do you enjoy more of? Or is it really a combination of both
which you enjoy? It's in the States, it's a little different. Like people, this is actually an insight I had this semester about my students. Because they were doing like they were doing semester-long projects or half-semester projects, and so I would, organize playtesting for them. So we'd bring people in and playtest, and blah blah blah, and then I would say, well, how did it go? And they're like, oh, we got really good feedback, and I'm like, excellent. Yeah. But then later on, I realized that when they were saying we got really good feedback, what they meant was, people liked the game and didn't say anything bad about it. Not the feedback was helpful, and I was like, oh no!
I recognize that one.
Yeah, but if you look at it, it makes sense because with how the education system works, students are they're sort of trained to be like, if you don't make if nothing goes wrong, then that's the best situation. Then you're doing a good job. Yeah, like
education
when something
is
goes
that way.
When something goes wrong, it's like bad. It's like a bad thing. So they're not used to seeking that out, I guess. So I'm trying to figure out a way of like
how
hammering
to hack
that
the
in.
system so they can.
Yeah, but it was a big insight for me
mistakes,
because of course I'm used to when someone says I got really good feedback, they're like, oh, they learned a lot of really useful stuff.
Yeah, how to improve their design, etc. Yeah.
So I just I didn't even make the connection until the end of the semester. I was like, wait, they mean something different than what I mean.
All right, and I'm really wondering, because you're doing dev streams where you're also like reviewing Ludum Dare jam games. Which is really cool, and of course you've designed on big AAA projects, high-profile indie projects. Like, you gave so much feedback on design.
Yes.
Is there any general line that you see that you say like, oh man, there are some general pitfalls, and probably that's something that players of games can recognize, that it annoys them?
Like consistently throughout like the games I played, like game jams and stuff. There's actually. I find myself every Ludum Dare playing games and occasionally giving like the same piece of feedback. And like for example, like in platformers, grace period jumping, like when you like allowing a few frames of airborne so that you can still jump. Yeah. That's something I always give because I always feel it. Yeah. And it's like, I expected to be able to jump there. And like consider, adding just a couple of frames, just not much, just so that when you're airborne, you're still allowed to jump. Yeah. But that's something that it's a very specific piece of feedback, right? Yeah. And so every time I've happened to give that, people are like, oh, that
that's obvious.
Maybe they were just, they never thought about that before, or maybe they felt something was not quite right but didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
So people seem to really appreciate like really specific feedback in those streams.
Of course, yeah.
Which is why I enjoy it. But yeah, there's definitely a few that I always give, and that's one really specific one.
I think it's a great one.
Yeah.
Do any others come to mind?
I guess some more general ones are I enjoy designing like the introductory stuff where players are going to learn. And so a lot of times I'll give feedback about, this was a lot and overwhelming, but you could probably, if you want to continue working on this game, you could, how to break the mechanics down in isolation. That would be a good way of teaching it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so if you have a big system, just take it step by step instead of just throwing someone in there, give some text and expect people to learn.
Which most of the time in a game jam, like you don't have that luxury of doing the training.
Production-wise,
But it's something like, oh well, if you want to like take this further, consider breaking these things down and introducing them separately.
Yeah.
Because it was really confusing, but once I understood it, it was fine. So like moments like that where it's not that the game is confusing, it's just they're not teaching it well.
Yeah. I think it's one of the hardest things actually, and it's one of those things as a player when I play a game and a game gets introduced to me. If it's done well, I don't even notice it. I'm just playing the game and having fun, and that's great design for you. And if you're agitated and you don't get something, then something went wrong.
Right. Yeah.
So, do you think in that sense design sometimes is a bit unsatisfactory because if you do it right, no one notices?
There's a lot of stuff like that, like camera work or UI or anything like that. And it is kind of, it's like a double-edged sword because if no one mentions it, often that means that we're really well. But it's just like, but I wish people noticed how good that part is.
Yeah.
Usually other designers notice. And so
course.
I think that's why developers like, getting feedback from other developers is because we notice those little things like, I really like what you did there with this little thing that a player would never notice.
Like the 6 frames.
Yeah.
I mean, like a player would never notice, but I think that would, for some players, if you're really into games, mind the camera is really something I would recommend to people because a camera usually, especially in 3D games of course, but also in 2D games, it does so much for the experience.
Yeah, and they're complicated too.
Yeah.
Like especially, I have a friend who was a designer on the God of War games, and he was talking about designing the camera for those games. There were so many different ways to design it and have it react to different things, and it was super, super complicated. But when you're playing the game, you don't notice,
don't really,
and that's the point.
But it does give you probably a general feeling that would totally change. Like for instance, I played Zelda: The Twilight Princess, and I noticed that the camera is always like a bit more, above Link and focusing on the ground. I don't know exactly why they chose to do it. I think it's just the render quality of the GameCube back in the day.
Yeah, probably.
It really gave me, or maybe that was the point of the designers, it gave me a kind of like isolated feel, like Zelda Ocarina of Time feels much more open to me. And that's because the camera usually is a little bit lower and you can see the environment while you're running. And it's just stuff like that can be so important.
Well, the good thing is if you do bring it up, say, the camera in this game does some really interesting things, then a player might think, actually pay attention. And once you start looking and you start noticing and playing around with how you move and how it pans, you can start seeing those things if you know what to look for, I guess. Yeah.
I think one thing people did realize with the God of War game is that the camera turned away while you did the mini game where you could have sex with with someone. That's not so subtle camera work, but okay, that's off topic. So you did a lot of projects yourself. Your latest project, which is also your Twitter.
Oh yes, Imaginal.
Picture,
yes, yeah.
Where you catch fireflies.
Yes.
What kind of project was that?
That was, so I'd just gone indie. I'd had a couple prototypes and that was one of them. And it was the sort of thing where I wanted to make something totally different than I had been making, which is high action shooters, right? So I was like, I want to make something super chill and really personal and just like non-commercial personal game. And so it was a mix of wanting to do that and the fact that the summer before I was at some place like catching lightning bugs and remembering how I used to do that as a kid. And from a theme perspective, I wanted to do something chill and personal. From a design perspective, I was really fascinated because I have a rule that I don't catch lightning bugs when they're lit. When they're not lit, when they're lit up. That's only when I can get them. Yeah. So I would watch them when they were not lit, flying around, and it was dusk, so they were just like little black silhouettes. And I was like thinking about how focused I was on tracking them when they went through the dark. And I was like, this is a really interesting mechanic. Yeah. So
my head is the camera.
Yeah, because I was.
This is the mouse. Yeah.
I was like, I want to see if I can make a game that focuses on tracking or gets people to think about tracking, and so that was sort of the design inspiration.
Cool.
And it ended up being like a super nice It was very personal. I basically made that game for my friends. That was cool. I had very specific people in mind as an audience. Yeah. And then it turned out it still resonated with a lot of other people. It's just I wanted to make a game that felt like spending time with me, basically, as a gift to my friends.
Nice.
So that's very different than,
So
Sunset
even
Overdrive.
before you came here, I spent time with you through your game.
Yeah.
That's a really cool idea.
Yeah.
You can get it on itch, Imaginal. And was it a big difference if you compare kind of that process? Because I think especially a lot of people that, play the big games, I sometimes hear it's hard for them to imagine that, how can you enjoy making a small game like that when you've worked on big projects?
Yeah.
And personally, I know that it can be way more satisfying to work on personal projects. But how do you feel about that?
Well, it's definitely a different experience. And even when I was still at Insomniac, I still did game jams and stuff. So
you've done a ton of game jams.
Maybe more than.
I think
maybe too many.
At least more than 15 or 20, I think, which is a lot.
Right, but they sort of satisfy different things. Like working in AAA was working on a team that big, on a project that big. It's just it was really gratifying when the teamwork was good to feel like part of this huge machine. Yeah. Like towards the end of development, when you were working on something, and then the next day you come in and there's all this new stuff and you're like, what happened to the game? There's a game here now. Oh my gosh! But it's a very different feel, and I still had a team for Imaginal. I worked with Michael McCarthy for sound, and Danae Wachowski did the art for me. So I had a little team that I was still doing stuff with. But just
on the design scale, there's less. I think there's less complicated decisions to make. There's less. You are also not really dependent on other people, so you can really make your own decisions if you want.
Yeah, I think that a lot of design in AAA is about communicating stuff to the team. Yeah. There's a ton of that, and you can see it if you go to GDC and you watch design track talks from bigger companies. You can sort of see that a lot of it is about communication with the team. Yeah. Which is something I enjoy. Yeah. And it's also nice the constraints can be kind of nice. It's like, okay, well these are the tools I have to work with, and this is I need to make a level that feels like this, and I just need to work on my own thing, my own little slice. And so it's I wouldn't say that making an indie game is simpler necessarily. They just have different decisions that need to be made. Yeah. And when you're working on your own game, it's like, oh gosh, I have to figure this out. I'm like, I don't know what to do. There's a problem. I need to figure it out. Versus, on a bigger game, it's like, well, who needs to figure this out? Let's work together to solve it.
Yeah. I'd say it's almost scarier sometimes working on a small project because you can do anything usually at any time. Yeah. The only constraint is your own production. Effort you could put into it.
Yeah, fortunately I got really good at estimating scope when I was working at Insomniac.
Yeah, were you guys on tight time constraints as well?
Yeah, I think this actually talked about this a bit in the talk I gave at Indie Development. When you're working on a big team, the biggest advantage you have is access to many experienced brains that already have a sense of scope. So you sort of learn from their feedback, and it's all experience, right? But you just get it like really fast when you're working on a big team like that.
So you learn a lot as well.
Yeah. So that, and then the fact that I was doing a lot of game jams, I learned how to scope on that small scale.
Yeah.
But working on the big games helped me think of scope in terms of what do I need to do to ship this game, and all that stuff at the end that people, if you've never shipped a game before, you don't have a feel for how long that's going to take yet, So that ended up helping a lot.
Cool. Because you're also like you're invested in, like you say, in the indie scene, and I guess, my final question is. The thing I really want to know is, like, is there any commercial project? Because you've been doing a lot of educational stuff, you've been focusing on your streams.
Yes.
Are there more commercial projects you really want to do, or?
Not at the moment. At the moment, I'm working on some VR stuff.
Okay.
But again, that's like for the joy of working in VR.
Okay, yeah.
It could eventually become a commercial product, but I think that. I sort of got that fulfilled working on Hyperlight.
Yeah.
But as far as my own stuff, I don't know. I don't know. I think that
you don't have you don't feel like you really need to or want to.
Right. Yeah.
You're happy prototyping.
Yeah. Basically, when I went indie, I had an understanding of like, okay, I'm not going to make games to make money because I know what that takes, and I know how much time and energy I have. So I'm going to find other ways to fund my existence.
Cool.
But I mean that might change. I don't, like I was mentioning, after this residency, I have no idea what I'm going to do next. So who knows?
Yeah.
Maybe.
What would you love to do? What would be your dream kind of thing to do?
I was actually talking about this on Twitter the other day. So. The last 7-day FPS, I made a game called Verticorps.
Yeah.
Which, it was a mod, it was an Unreal mod.
Just 7-day FPS is a small game jam where people create innovative first-person shooter titles. Cool.
And I made it as a gift for another designer I knew.
Cool.
Because he used to work in QA, and he would always tell these stories about his time in QA, and he was on like Medal of Honor or something, and said that when they were playing multiplayer, there was a bug where the bodies would not ragdoll when they were killed. They would just stand in place. So over time, all these bodies would build up, and then the QA testers started like hiding, just like standing still.
Oh, wow,
And
nice.
he said it was super fun, and they were bummed when they fixed the bug. And I was like, oh, you should just make that. That sounds like a fun game.
That's a cool game.
And he's like, oh, I'm busy, blah, blah, blah. So I was like, I will make this as a gift. And I showed it to him early on, and he was so excited about it that he designed the level for me. So he did the map. And it was just a really fun game. It's fun to play. But it's all the wrong things for a commercial project.
Yeah.
It's online multiplayer. It's deathmatch only. There's no progression. It's like all the things you wouldn't want to do if you were trying to make money.
But still, the cool thing is it could take off in this modern day.
Yeah, I'd say if I had infinite resources or whatever to make any game I wanted, I would make that, because I love making weird games and I love weird interactions, but I was raised as a designer on shooters, and so I have a really special place in my heart for shooters and combat design.
Cool. So what's the next shooter you're gonna play?
When I get back to a machine that is robust enough, I want to play Doom. I was watching a friend of mine play it that I was visiting recently, and it was actually a gauge. I was trying to see if it was going to be too gory for me, because I'm very squeamish. But I loved, Doom was a formative game for me growing up. And it turns out it's so ridiculous and over the top and comical that it's not really going to bother me. But I could see that, I was excited to see how arena focused the combat was. And I was like, oh, that looks, I want to play this for reals. So probably when I get back to the States,
go to Doom.
That's probably going to be the first thing that I play.
Is there anything else you want to share with us before we say goodbye? Any special kind of...
No.
Small things?
You caught me off guard. I don't know.
Sorry.
What do people normally say when you ask them that?
Sometimes really weird, bizarre, little trippy things, like little details they still want to share. Or sometimes people, I used to close the show with a tip for people who want to make games. So if you have any like general, a lot of people who are watching might have the idea that they're someday going to work or make a game. Or
I will try and give a specific tip, because normally when you ask that, people give general tips like make games or whatever. So I'm assuming all of those have been given. So I will say, if you are making a shooter, your level design is more informed by the defensive capability of the player than the guns or the enemies. So like, how do you not die in the game? A first-person shooter is defined by how do you not die, because that means, do you have regenerative health? Is it a cover mechanic? Basically, if you are about to die in your game, what do you do? And that thing informs so much of your level design. And people don't tend to think about it a lot, because they tend to be like, oh, shooter, thinking about the guns, thinking about the enemies.
What do I hit?
But think about how you want your player to not die. And that's going to tell you a lot about how your levels should go.
That is top-notch advice.
That is my hyper-specific game development
tip. But I love it. Thanks a lot.
I have to credit Drew Murray, who was my lead designer at Insomniac. He was the one who taught me that.
Nice.
So.
Thanks, Drew. And thanks, Lisa, for getting over here. If you're ever back in the Netherlands, of course, you're always welcome.
All right, great. Sure.
It was really great to have you by. You can follow her on Twitter, and it's at Wordle.
Wordle, yes.
Yeah, so that's WERTLE. And you have some cool streams as well. So just check it out. And I'm going to be back with another Indiekings in Dutch.